Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to today's FS Club webinar, From Paper Tape to Low Latency Data, a Lifetime in Market Data. And we have today one of my dear friends, Herbie Skeete, and we're going to be discussing, this is a bit of kind of This Is Your Life, Herbie, but we're going to also be looking at the history of Reuters and looking to the future. Herbie and I are somewhat contemporaneous in terms of our use of computers in finance. You'll know me, Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it really is my privilege to be able to introduce so many of these fantastic webinar series from FS Club. We can only do so thanks to the generosity of our sponsors, who are very kind and allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And today we're going to be bringing technology, finance, and economics all together in a good look at the trajectory that's been followed in terms of finance and computing. But enough of that by way of introduction. Just to remind you of the format, I'll get out of your way as quickly as I can so that you can hear from Herbie. Herbie's going to speak for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have a fairly interactive discussion about topics. And please do use the GoToWebinar question facility. It's there on the control panel that you have. Please do ask your questions via that. Don't send them to me via email because I'm here with you, and I'll only pick up those questions afterwards. And then a word of warning for those of you who are fast on the buzzers. Well, Herbie has three poll questions, which I think will help us all get a flavor for what we know and what we don't know. But with that, you've seen Herbie's biography in the invitation, and it's also up on the site. And Herbie, the floor is very much yours.
Well, thanks, Mike. Thanks for your kind introduction. As the bell said, I spent a lifetime in Reuters. Of course, Reuters is now known as Refinitiv after various transactions. And Refinitiv is really the market data assets of what used to be known as Reuters or Thomson Reuters. Next slide, please, Michael. Now, Reuters was one of the world's very first fintech companies. Now, when I was preparing this presentation, I ran it past my former colleagues in editorial, and I was told, you can't say that. You can't prove it. And of course, in Reuters, unless you can verify a fact by getting three different people to verify it, you can't say it. But going back to 1850, it's very difficult to get anyone to say whether it's true or not. But as far as I'm concerned, there weren't many companies around in those days which combined technology and financial information. So we were really one of the world's very first fintech companies. And, innovation was part of the Reuters DNA and still is today to a certain extent. Now, the story begins not with paper tape, but with carrier pigeons. In that the founder of Reuters, Paul Julius Reuter, he used the carrier pigeons to transmit stock and commodity prices from Brussels, where the telegraph line ended in Belgium, to Aachen, where the German line began. Now, some of you on the call today may remember a colleague of mine by the name of Andre Villeneuve. But one of Andre Villeneuve's favorite sayings to graduate trainees and young interns was, there's a gap in the market, but is there a market in the gap? As far as the good baron was concerned, there was indeed a gap in the market and a market in the gap. And pigeons have played a glorious part of Reuters history until fairly recently. And in fact, the very last time they were used was during the Second World War, when they were used by our war correspondents to send messages from the Normandy beachheads back to London. And I'm reliably informed that the pigeons were configured in a live standby mode, just in case one of them got shot down by enemy fire. Now, Reuters has always been either slightly behind or in advance of technology, and the telegraph line or the cable was no exception. And when the cable was laid between the UK and the USA, Reuters was not far behind, as it were, embedding its journalists in the USA behind the telegraph. And this coverage, like now, wasn't just news of what was going on in the world of politics. It also included, what was going on in the world of commerce, shipping, and other market moving activities like that. But still, politics was also part of what Reuters did. And when President Lincoln was assassinated, I don't remember what year it was, but certainly Reuters was the very first to bring the news back to London using the telegraph. Now, part of the myth of Reuters is that we were actually 2 days ahead of the competition. I'm afraid it wasn't as much as that. It was more. It was a mere 2 hours. But in those days, 2 hours was a long time. Even today, it's a lifetime. But that was enough time for our clients to, as it were, fill their boots. Now, to someone like myself who spent a lifetime in financial markets, technology, like a capacity of central systems, comms capacity, we're always fighting a losing battle in terms of it doesn't matter how much capacity you have, the data for markets is always threatening to overwhelm it. And it was also the case even in 1865, when messages from the London Stock Exchange was overwhelming the telegraph network. It just goes to show that there's never anything new under the sun. Now we're going to jump forward 100 years, you'll be pleased to note, to the very first product of Reuters in the modern era, the very first electronic product. And that product was the Reuters Stockmaster. Now, this product was not devised by Reuters itself. It was the typical two guys in a garage back in the States who came up with this service. And this was a product which it was based around an IBM 360. And information from stock and commodity exchanges will come in, will get processed by the 360, and then the data will be stored on magnetic drums. And in the slide, you can see a sectionalized photograph of a drum, and those drums were very, very fast. I think you'll probably find that they're much faster than even a modern hard disk, and that you have so many read-write heads there. And of course, if one of the heads crashed into the drum, that was a big problem. But they were incredibly fast. And the machine to actually get it going, you had to bootstrap it, and that meant going to the front panel, flicking some switches, and then using paper tape to get the bootstrap program going. And the software and any data was loaded from punch cards. And if you were a new kid on the block, as I was back in 1978, I didn't join in 64, by the way. I joined in 1978. I may look as though I joined in 64, but that wasn't the case. If you were a new kid, for the first 6 months, you weren't allowed to compile code or to assemble code. You actually had to hand assemble everything. And that was done so that you get to know the instruction set inside out, but also so that you'll get to understand how the hardware worked. Because in those days, you had to actually understand how the hardware worked and how the software worked. And also, any patches that had to be written, you were the person responsible for writing the patches and loading them via the front panel. But, it certainly taught you how the machines work, and you got to know it inside out. And I can tell you that debugging software was not a job for the faint-hearted. Now, there were several firsts associated with the introduction of the Stockmaster service. For example, the very first transatlantic TDM was installed as part of the project. And a 2400 bits per second link across the Atlantic was installed, again, as part of this project. Now, that speed, 2400 bits per second, may seem to be terribly slow. But in those days, it was terribly fast. In fact, when I joined in 78, 9600 bits per second it wasn't quite as fast as it got, but it wasn't far off being very fast. I know today we talk in terms of gigabits and stuff like that, but in those days, those were the speeds that we were operating with. And in fact, many of the feeds coming into the Stockmaster service, there weren't feeds as we know them today. A lot of the feeds were a paper tape being loaded into the system, or in Reuters there were clerks on the floor of the exchange using the telegraph to send messages, to send prices back to the system. And in those days, if something didn't exist, we either had to invent it or build it. There was no Amazon. You couldn't just go and order it. So the very first operational consoles were actually built by a fish and chip shop fitter who built the very first consoles. Now, you probably don't think that this is true, but I can assure you it is really true. There's a very good history of Reuters written by Professor Donald Reed, in which you'll find this and a lot more information. So, you had to be inventive, otherwise you couldn't get a product launched. Now, the very next thing in Reuters after the Stockmaster, but here we're going to have a poll. So,
great. So I'm going to launch the poll now, folks, just to try and get a handle on the audience. panelists are not allowed to vote, including myself, but I will say that yes, I was using paper tape and punch cards on PDP-8s and IBM 360s at the same era as Herbie. Got nearly everybody who's voted. I'm just going to close the poll here. And there you go.
Well, it just goes to show.
And there we are.
I must say,
sort of split 50-50 there, Herbie.
yeah, but I'm surprised that more people than I thought have actually used punch cards or paper tape. Anyhow, the next big part of our project in Reuters was the Reuters monitor system. And this system was conceived in 1972. Some of you with long memories may recall that Nixon ended the ability to convert the US dollar into a fixed amount of gold. And this was the ending of the Bretton Woods Agreement. And instead of having static exchange rates, fixed rates of like, pound versus a dollar or whatever, currencies can now float against each other. And this new market, the unregulated market of foreign exchange emerged. Now, in those days, Reuters was not a very rich company, believe it or not. It didn't have much money to spend. And the idea of developing a network for this market where dealers could trade foreign exchange was one which the company was very attracted to. But at the same time, there were many risks involved. And it was a case of, should we bet the farm that we're going to make some money out of this new market? I think that there was some market survey done by some of the early marketing guys in Reuters, and they thought that this market, probably no more than 25 clients could be found for it after like 3 or 4 years. Now, as we're going to see later on, that was not the case. There were a lot more than that. And one of the things that was causing problems was that the telecom authorities in those days were very much against anyone carrying traffic, a third party carrying traffic on a leased line, and that was just one of the problems that Reuters had to overcome. Another of the problems was that the software had to be reliable and it had to be efficient, because you don't want to be exposing your exchange rates on a system that was going to fall over any minute, every second. It just wasn't on. Next slide, please, Michael. And also, until then, Reuters' expertise had been mainly in the field of hardware. However, Reuters was a company used to using telecom networks, and the Reuters principles, which goes back to its days as an editorial company, was that you had to be accurate, you had to be fast, and your news had to be impartial. And integrity was at the very core of everything that Reuters did. And this was what the banks wanted to hear, because, as I said, the banks wouldn't give their precious rates to someone who was not trusted to actually do a good job. Now, when we look at the technical context, Microsoft and Apple didn't exist then, and the founders of Google weren't even a gleam in their parents' eyes. They weren't born then. And Intel had just launched its first 4-bit microprocessor. And the internet as we know it today wasn't around. There was an ARPANET, but I'm not sure how many of you remember the ARPANET. Michael probably does, I'm sure, but not many people do. But the ARPANET was not something that lent itself to easy use. And another problem was that there wasn't a suitable operating system for Reuters to use. So what did the company do? It actually invented its own operating system, which was fast and reliable, because nothing existed that could actually get the job done. So typically of Reuters in those days, you innovate. You actually develop your own operating system. And that system was known as Rex. I really can't remember what Rex stood for, but it was a very good operating system. There was also no suitable high-level language on which to base the development. And the environment in which the software was being developed was very primitive, involving paper tape, mag tape, and data entry via teletype. And, the software was developed on PDP-8s, and there was a lot of memory to use. In fact, the computer just had 8 instructions and 2 addressable registers. My iPhone has more memory today and is more powerful than the machines of that era. And those are just some of the challenges that Reuters had to overcome. But overcome them they did. And the Reuters monitor system service was launched in 1973. And when it was launched, I think there were approximately 30 clients. And the photograph you can see there on the screen, with lots of phones, lots of wires, some people having like 2 phones, 3 phones. That's what a dealing room looked like before monitor. It was very noisy. In fact, they're noisy today as well. And lots of phones and no screens, just phones. Now, all that changed with the introduction of monitor. And now we can see the very first monitor terminal looking very sexy, very nice. And that was no accident. And that Reuters engaged with state-of-the-art designers to actually come up with something looking very, very attractive. And today's foreign exchange market, which was pioneered by Reuters, it now trades something like $6.6 trillion a day, and that's a figure from 2019. So from small beginnings, that market is now one of the biggest markets in the world. And it's not just Reuters. There were companies like telegraph was also around in those days. It started after we did, and then of course Bloomberg afterwards. But it's now a very big market. But that market went from the telephone onto the screen, and it's never looked back. The next logical poll is this one. Okay, the results are in. Okay. Okay, the next logical development in the foreign exchange market, as far as we were concerned in Reuters, was the development of a dealing system. The dealing system was launched in 1981 with 145 subscribers. Now, when I say dealing, it wasn't dealing by matching. It was what we call conversational dealing, in which the traders could communicate on the Reuters system to buy or sell foreign exchange. And initially, there were two panels on the screen, in which dealers could have a conversation, and then that expanded to 4. Now, in many respects, this was the world's first social media platform. Unfortunately, the management of the day, well, not all of them, but some of them, they thought that this was a serious product and should only be used for serious activities like trading. It shouldn't be used for chit-chat, like arranging lunch, drinks, or stuff like that. Now, that was a very serious mistake on the part of Reuters management, because Bloomberg was just about to be born, and the glue of Bloomberg was the messaging system. But Reuters had a messaging system that was widely used by traders way ahead of Bloomberg. But unfortunately, Reuters never capitalized on it. Now, the only drawback of allowing traders to talk to each other was if there was a war between two countries, as happened during the Falklands conflict between the UK and Argentina. Traders will often use the dealing platform to hurl insults at each other. So Reuters had to go and police the dealing system to make sure that such things didn't get out of hand. But not a good idea having a conversation when there's a war on. Now, Reuters was always one for early use of technology, and Reuters was talking to Microsoft, to Apple, academics, research labs, and because of all the learning that we did with early technology using Windows icons and mice, Reuters was able to launch what was called the Advanced Reuters Terminal in 1986. And this was the very first terminal that Reuters had that used Microsoft Windows. Now, those of you who used Windows in those days will know that it was extremely unreliable. You often got the blue screen of death. And I well remember Bill Gates coming around to Reuters, begging and pleading for Reuters to actually use Windows. And that's something that didn't happen to a limited extent until 1986. But it was actually the beginning of Reuters beginning to get a bit more open and so on. And this new terminal combined data from monitor with news, graphics, and spreadsheet capabilities, and it sold very, very well. Now, the next development after that was IDN, which was Reuters' first attempt to integrate all of its product lines on one system.
Sorry there, Herbie. I accidentally slipped.
That's okay. Okay. And so IDN was launched in 1987. And this product was where Reuters began to integrate all of its data on one network. And the very first product to get launched on the network was actually 2000. And you remember when we were discussing the Stockmaster, what I forgot to say was that Reuters had the rights to this product for everywhere in the world apart from North America. And as part of that deal, all of the North American exchange data came from Ultronics. And when that was taken over by ADP GTIS, that continued. So when IDN was launched in 1987, Reuters was able to source all of its data from its own resources. Now, shortly after the IDN was launched, there was a market crash in October. And although the system was designed to handle message rates way beyond what we had ever seen, the October crash saw those rates, the rates of traffic being much higher than that. But the IDN network was able to stand the strain. But that really started Reuters having a serious look at predicting the future in terms of looking at what sort of regulatory developments are going to be happening over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, so that we could actually gauge what's going to be the impact on networks, central systems, and last mile delivery. But also we began to engage in a purposeful way with hardware companies, software companies, so that we could see what developments were going to be taking place over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, and 4 years, so that we could bake all that into future requirements and to make sure that our central systems could always cope. Now, as I said before, Reuters was becoming more open with the introduction of Microsoft Windows. And in 1987, Reuters installed its very first data room system, where our clients could integrate data not just from Reuters, but from other vendors like Bloomberg or Telluride or whoever, and make them available on the broker's own screens. At the same time, Unix workstations began to appear in the market, and these were much more powerful than conventional PCs, and quickly became a favorite with traders. So in '87, Reuters began to go mainstream, away from having its own hardware, away from having homebrewed operating systems, into like Microsoft Windows, Unix, and other operating systems. A much more open company. Now, dealing, as I explained before, was conversational dealing. But in 1988, Reuters began to launch into dealing by matching. But before I go there, this is what a typical dealing room looked like in 1987. And if you remember what the first photograph you saw of dealers with phones and twisted cables, this is a far cry from that. It's a very neat looking dealing room, and that was a Reuters dealing room of circa 1987. Very different from the dealing rooms of the early 70s. Now, in 1988, Reuters came to an agreement with the CME to develop a trading system, and this system, which is called Globex, was used by the CME outside of the open outcry hours to provide 24-hour trading. And this was the first example of Reuters acting as a turnkey systems operator. Now, some of you may recall Life, which was, I think, born in the mid-'80s. And Life was an exchange that had mostly a floor, but also it had an automated trading system. But this automated trading system, there was only one contract on it that was traded solely on the automated trading system, and that, I think, was the Japanese government bond contract. The most popular contract that Life had in those days was a German bond contract. Sadly for Life, the new Deutsche Turbine-Börse, which is now called Eurex today, that came into existence in around 1988-89, and within weeks of the DTB starting up, it took all the liquidity of the Life German bond contract away from Life onto the DTB market. DTB, I must explain, was a totally automated trading system. Now Reuters was talking to Life about coming on board the Globex system, but unfortunately, Life, despite us talking to them for many months, didn't agree to it. And we often wondered what would have happened if Life had come on board Globex from the very beginning. Would they have lost all that liquidity to DTB? And remember, once an exchange loses liquidity, it very rarely comes back, and that's what happened to Life. In fact, it was a near life, no pun intended, but it was a near life experience for Life. It almost died, but of course it came back. Okay, so the next big thing for Reuters was the launch of proper dealing. That's dealing with matching of bids and offers, and that happened in 1992. And the currencies available were dollar sterling, dollar mark, and dollar yen. And that system took many more years to develop than was originally envisaged. In fact, the very first dealing system was meant to be matching, but the powers the powers that be thought it was going to be a step too far, and that it was going to be very complicated. They were very much correct in that the dealing system, I think it was 3 or 4 years late by the time it was launched. And I remember the CEO going to the market many times to explain why it was late, and the share price diving on each occasion. But it was eventually launched in 1992. Now, as well as processing feeds, having automated trading system, Reuters was also playing with artificial intelligence, machine learning, parallel processing, and such techniques. And I doubt whether anyone here, even Michael, is probably aware that Reuters actually developed the world's very first AI-powered market surveillance system. But we did. I remember going to Sydney to see Professor Aitken, who developed Smarts, and we compared notes. And it was remarkable, as he showed the screenshots of all the screen displays, they were very much alike. Our system was a lot more AI than Smarts, and it actually worked. Unfortunately, Reuters management wouldn't allow it to be sold to banks, believe it or not. But we actually had a world-beating software, which Reuters management thought that we shouldn't get into such markets. We were also working with a consortium of academic institutions using parallel processing for analysis of financial information. And out of that came something similar to OpenFin. So we had OpenFin long before OpenFin existed. But again, nothing happened to it. We were also displaying data and disseminating data using the internet. But again, Reuters management failed to use that. It was felt that if we were to distribute data via the internet, it would actually, that the pricing that we had for our conventional products would get eroded. Now, as far as I was concerned, either you do it to yourself or someone does it to you. But Reuters, lost a trick in not making use of the internet. Things like using pattern recognition as well, we were actually doing. And on the dealing system, we were looking at using sort of voice recognition systems for trader input. Unfortunately, there were a few drawbacks to that, in that the voice recognition software was a bit flaky in those days, and the ability to recognize a trader's lunch before and after lunch was a bit of a problem. Now, what is the future of Reuters, or Refinitiv as it is called today? But before we go there, let's have a poll for your view on that.
And just launching that poll now, Herbie. So, folks, fingers on buzzers, please. And I don't have anybody who's trying to beat Trevor Hilder's 1974 on ICL 1900 mainframe. So, Trevor, you may be holding the record here. And I'll just close that poll in a second. Just virtually everyone has voted. Great. Well, not a very optimistic audience. I don't know if it's a COVID lockdown or what have you, but not optimistic about Reuters and Refinitiv reclaiming its glory.
Okay.
Here we go. Let me just share that with you.
Okay.
There we go. So 64% versus 36.
Well, I can't say, Michael, that I blame them, to be honest. In fact, if you go to the next slide now, you'll see my view of the future of Reuters, or rather, Refinitiv, as it's called these days. Now, Refinitiv, as most of you know, is going to be acquired by the LSE Group, and that's expected to close in the first quarter of next year. That is if the European Commission competition authorities gives approval. But the question is, will Reuters get its mojo back? I don't think so. I think that the combination of the LSE and Reuters, you're going to have a very risk-averse company. You're going to have a company run by essentially bureaucrats, run by committee, and you can't innovate by committee. I remember before I left Reuters, I had a chat with Devin Bennett and Tom Grosser, who said to me, Herbie, before you go, we want you to tell us how you guys innovated in the good old days. I said, Tom, Devin, you can't teach innovation. You have to have the right environment for it. And by that stage, the environment in Reuters was not conducive towards innovation. It was basically a company run by committee, a company run by spreadsheet. And if a company is overly bureaucratic, it's not going to innovate. And if you make incremental changes, you're never going to have the big victories, the big innovations that make a difference. You don't have any products. So to conclude, to summarize on where the company is or was, it was a very interesting company, a very wonderful company. As one of my friends once said, we were privileged to work in the world's biggest toy factory. You came in every day, you had a new challenge, and we devised products that were really revolutionary, products that didn't exist. And, it wasn't any use going to the market and asking what they thought about whether a product should be done or not, because the traders were too busy to talk to you. We actually had to come up. Obviously, you had to go and talk to the market and get guidance from them. But Reuters had to take risk as well. And the Reuters of today is, as I said before, is risk averse. And in those days, if the technology wasn't available or it's too expensive, you had to actually come up with a solution yourself. You couldn't go and buy it off the shelf in many respects. So no problem was insoluble. Today's Reuters or today's Refinitiv is one that's incredibly bureaucratic, where it's management by spreadsheet, management by rules. In those days, we believed that rules were made to be broken. Just don't get caught. Technical boundaries were pushed to the limit, and that was done to come up with unique global products. Thanks very much.
Herbie, that was wonderful. You bring back too many memories, I think. I was interested. Well, one of the intriguing things is that there's a Telegraph Street in the City of London in Broad Street Ward, and it's located there actually because of the stock exchange, because the option was to locate it near the old GPO offices, but instead they chose to locate it to be there. And I think a lot of people forget how important that freeing up of data transmission on the lines was. That's a really good reminder, particularly in these days of the splinter net, as it's sometimes called, as we're looking at various types of walled gardens. For example, the Real Time Club was founded by a group of IT entrepreneurs. I was chairman at one point many years later, but back in the late 60s to lobby the UK government to allow data transmission. And in fact, one of the weirdest things that I ever came across was in the early 80s. One of the most valuable bits of British Leyland was that due to some odd clause, British Leyland was allowed to run its own transmission lines and sell the data on it, and made a business out of that, which was called Istel. So interesting bits there. Anyway, it's great here. We've got a lot of other things to go, but just before we pile in, Herbie, how would you summarize? Where did it all go wrong? Here's this great business. You've given us a good example of what is wrong, but where did it go wrong?
Okay, well, it started to go wrong in the 80s. I wouldn't say that it's the fault of Peter Job. He was the CEO then. But I would say that probably David Ure or John Parcells should have been appointed CEO. But it wasn't just that. Some of you may recall that in 1988, Reuters faced a life and death situation. Reuters was accused of stealing Bloomberg's data, and the U.S. authorities came after Reuters, and that was the New York DA, and that meant that everything that we were doing came to a grinding halt. It meant that lawyers were more or less running the company, and that went on for 2 years, and we could do absolutely nothing. The company became very bureaucratic, and everything had to be approved by lawyers, and that sucked the very life out of the company. In fact, a lot of us thought that Michael Bloomberg knew that the charge was baseless, but this was going to tie up the company in knots for the next 2 or 3 years, and so it proved. The U.S. authorities used the RICO Act, which is something that you apply against mobsters, against Reuters. And I could tell you that when people like myself were flying into New York, you weren't sure whether you're going to be met by the authorities and given a orange jumpsuit to put on, actually. It was that serious. In fact, some of us were warned that if the U.S. authorities asked the British authorities to investigate what was going on over here as well, that was going to be a criminal matter, and the company couldn't use paid for lawyers. So some of us were actually advised to get our own legal advice. But I tell you, the company was tied up in knots for several years, and after that, Tom Grosser became CEO. Tom Grosser was the guy, by the way, the lawyer in charge internally of the Bloomberg case. Him and Devin Bennig. And shortly after that, they became the CEO and the deputy of Reuters, and Reuters became a company run by lawyers and accountants. It was running a company by spreadsheet.
Well, in our little competition on my computing is older than yours, you're not going to be surprised on this one, Herbie. Your old friend Ian Hillier-Brooke is pointing out that he first met you at Zeus Hermes in about 71, but he previously started on Deuce, D-E-U-C-E, in 1954. So.
Yeah, I forgot. I was at Zeus Hermes before going to Reuters. I think Zeus Hermes came to Portugal afterwards.
Now, we've got a couple of comments here. J. White Gresser is asking, you didn't mention the impact of high-frequency trading. And Richard Metcalf is sort of interested in which sort of latency of market data is helpful for the public good and which allows private intermediaries to operate sustainably. Any thoughts on that?
Okay, well, I didn't mention high-frequency trading because, in 20 minutes you can't cover everything. It's my coupled answer to that. But obviously, Reuters was the inventor of high-speed data feeds, I would say. In that the very first logical feeds were done by Reuters, and that Reuters always believed in having logical data. And when Reuters went the route of logical data, that really made high-frequency trading possible, or rather easier to do. This is something which the authorities often frowned on. That in the States, you have the New York District Attorney going against Reuters and other vendors because they thought that if you provided faster fees at a price different to the ordinary fees, this was given an unfair advantage to traders who couldn't afford it. My argument to that is like, if you can't afford a Formula One car, you don't have one. You have an old banger. But low latency is something that today is a given in markets. Every shop has access to low latency feeds. It doesn't really distinguish between those who have the wherewithal to use it or not. So HFT is here with us. Low latency is here with us, and it's here to stay. It's not going to go away. But whether it gives someone an unfair advantage or not, I don't think so. Whatever the FCA or SEC thing.
Got time to take just two more questions. One sort of negative and one sort of positive. So I'll start with the slightly negative one here. Bob McDowell's asked, must we not accept that the products exemplified by Reuters have reached their apex, as indeed have the products and services which Reuters supported.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Michael?
Have the products and services that were exemplified by Reuters really sort of reached their apex? You know, are we seeing kind of, I guess Bob's asking, are we sort of seeing the flattening of innovation in this space? Sure, big data.
No, I don't think so. I think it's just that Reuters has stopped innovating, but there are lots of little companies that are innovating, doing some wonderful things. That's the problem with companies like Reuters. They get long in the tooth, and they can't reinvent themselves. But there are lots of players now. It's easier now to innovate than it was before, because data is readily available, hardware, software is readily available. So things that you couldn't dream of years ago are now readily available. And that's the problem, is that the ability to surprise and delight is no longer there. Where's the product that Reuters or Bloomberg, for that matter, have come up with that you say, wow, I never thought of that. I haven't seen one of those products for a long time. We see more of the same, bent down a tiny bit faster and sexier screens, but that's all. There's been nothing new under the sun for years. Okay, you have blockchain, but I'm sure you'll tell us that blockchain has existed for forever.
Yeah. And kind of ending on a sort of a positive note, Ian Sheridan is trying to point us away from just the efficiencies of smartphones and chip power. He says history shows human liquid networks socializing is an immense innovation catalyst. What does Herbie think about how innovation can thrive in this era?
Well, innovation thrives from when. Well, let me tell you how we used to do it in the old days. You're going to talk to people who have similar problems, but slightly different. You don't live in isolation. The very first marketing office that I was in Reuters, you had there were crappy offices. You had a very long corridor. You had the guy who did FX, the guy who did commodities, the guy who did derivatives. And we were going to talk to each other over coffee, and you found out that the problems were similar, but the solutions were a lot different. And by talking to each other, we would spark ideas of each other. And that's the way you do it. You actually begin to experiment. You begin to look at things with different eyes. But I tell you that the best people for this are young people. Is that young people who don't know that something is impossible. If you think that something if you think that everything is possible, that's when you can innovate. If you think it's been done before, why try? That's when things don't happen. And one of the things we had to fight against when I was a young kid in Reuters was someone saying, we tried that 5 years ago and it didn't work. And I would say, well, why didn't it work? And no one knew. No one could tell you why it didn't work. But it's when people say, well, I don't think you're right. I think I'm going to try this. I'm going to try that. Perhaps I didn't try it this way. But it's by people who don't think that something is impossible. Everything is possible. That's what you have to be. You have to learn to experiment. You have to learn to try things, and that nothing is impossible. Let's try it. I think was it Branson who said, "Screw it, let's try it," or something like that. That's the way you have to be. Otherwise, nothing ever changes. You're just incrementally change things. You have to go and dream strange dreams, and just try everything. You don't innovate by going to a school, learning it from a book. You either have it or don't have it. But you must have the right environment in which to innovate. One of the good things about Reuters in those days is that we were allowed to do that. We were allowed to try things, to risk things, and no one told us don't try. The other thing, you had to try, and don't make a big mistake. Make a small mistake and learn from it. That was the secret.
Herbie, that's a great place to end. Sadly, because we're out of time, I've got a lot of comments here, which I will be sending to Herbie with your email, so he can get back to you, in touch with you if you wish. But Herbie, thank you so much, and I think you've convinced me in a lot of ways that it is about culture. Much as that's a bit of a vague word, but what you've actually done is you've pointed out, and I can see almost that turning point where that U.S. litigation probably caused the company to become less risk taking, more risk averse, and therefore that kind of killed the ability to innovate, which had made it such a success over a century and more. Sadly, folks, I've got to draw it to a close, as you know. I'll thank Herbie in a minute, but firstly, I'd like to thank our sponsors. Many of you have grown up looking at Reuters as one of the great innovation companies where technology meets finance. And I hope that you enjoyed a lot of this background and perhaps a salutary warning about keeping that innovation going. We wish those of you who are in Refinitiv the best of success trying to turn it around. So the game is not over yet, and the history is not finished. I'd like to thank all of you out there in the audience for watching, and I'd like to thank you too for a fairly active set of comments and questions. I had no idea how many people were from our era, Herbie, but also a lot of other younger folks out there listening. We've got an interesting session tomorrow on the Bank of England, the PRA, work on what they're asking people to do in terms of bringing together their demands for operational resilience. We are going to be looking at the future of computing on Thursday when we're going to look at functional programming in finance. That'll be an interesting technical session for those who are there. And next week we have a whole variety of webinars as well, all of which you are welcome to check out on the website and join us. So thank you for that. Herbie, unfortunately, I can't open the floodgates here and show you how very engaged this audience has been. So I'll have to thank you on their behalf, if I may, and I will bring down my...
Before you go, this is a Stockmaster terminal, which I didn't show you before, but this is what a Stockmaster terminal looks like. It's one of the few left in captivity. So
yes,
this is a Stockmaster terminal.
Well, and I will thank you with something equally antiquated, which is my Korean clapper. So thank you so much, Herbie. I really appreciate you sharing that history with us, and it's certainly not over yet.
Indeed not. My pension's at risk otherwise.
We'll work on saving it. Take care.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye.